Welcome. And the first question we ask is, what's your name and where are you now?
So my name is Ayhan Alman, and I'm in the UK, in the north of England at the moment. To be precise, I'm based in Liverpool right now.
And who are you as a human being?
So this is one of the questions that's been like I guess the most difficult for most of the interviews I've seen. And right now I am in touch with, I think, I've done a lot of prep, how I wanted to answer this question. And to be honest, right now, I'm just in touch with the in-between, what's between my body, between my bones, between my nervous system. And to be precise, I'm in touch with my soul because it's been quite a tough week. I have found out on Tuesday that my cousin has been affected by the earthquake in Turkey. So, and today I heard that her body was found. So, which put all this stuff, who are you, what are you, what are your values, and like all this stuff a little bit more into perspective, and just in touch with my soul right now.
And how do you hold that in between, and how do you converse with your soul now, as it's kind of really coming from the ground in perspective, in the figure?
So my body does it. And and there's some anxiety around, the nervous system being active in some way and wanting to protect, and, being gentle towards the soul. Because I think it's like, see, I want to say my soul is fine. The body is hurting. The mind is hurting. The nervous system is hurting.
And what I'm hearing, the soul is containing all of that.
Yeah, like, exactly. It's like the body is not holding the soul, but maybe the soul is holding the body and the nervous system. Like it's the other way around, actually, as we speak about it. Yeah.
And I'm curious, you mentioned the difficulty in the week, and that some other things have come in perspective, and I'm wondering that that impacts that the news had on you. What do you think they have made more or less important suddenly?
So on Tuesday, so I unfollowed all news outlets on my social media. I don't watch TV. I'm very isolated about news and all of that. So the only news I get is if somebody from my social network posts something. So on Monday evening, I saw some photos of collapsing building, which I find like, okay, don't post this. Like that was my initial thought, And in the evening, my ex-partner called and he was like, hey, is your family okay in Turkey? And, part of me was like, why is he asking that question? My family is my family is actually in Germany, but my extended family is in Turkey. So it didn't cross even my mind that, my cousin had moved to the region for some, for some reason. It really didn't cross my mind. So it's a bit like, brushed it off and thought, okay. So, and then on Tuesday when my mom called, like at lunchtime, and told me the news that, my cousin is missing, I completely lost it. I just, started like shouting at my mom, like got really angry. And, like if I didn't know the psychological process of trauma, I would say, I would really hate myself for doing what I did. But I know the shock was so overwhelming that my mom had to, blow. I did call her after, apologized, and we repaired and all of that. So it's all okay. And I explained to her, this is like, please don't be the messenger of bad news to anybody. I don't want you to be shouted at by people like me or, others who might get a real shock from the news. But the news was like her husband and her one child were found, but the husband passed away after the rescue and she was still missing. So on Tuesday, on today, like at 4 o'clock or so, I've got the news that her body was found and her son's body was found. And I'm not answering your question. I'm just explaining the sequence of events, right? But I think the moment my mom told me the news, I knew she was dead. My soul knew she was dead. My mind didn't want to accept it. My nervous system didn't want to accept it. My body didn't want to accept it. My soul knew she was dead.
And interestingly, as you were speaking, I felt, although the epicenter was in Turkey, the tremor is felt really everywhere. And it feels like we're separate, but somehow there are these threads that really connect us.
See, I'm so far removed from particularly my extended family. So my family is Turkish. I have Turkish origin, but I was born and raised in Germany. And so I lost touch with my cousin, So I didn't know she lived there and all of that. But
And as this is called the humans of Gestalt, what came to me as you were talking, there were two things actually. You mentioned gentleness and being gentle to oneself, and how knowing the process of shock trauma and how it can impact us helped you to be gentle. And I really wanted to kind of stay with those words and your experience, and maybe to ask you, how did you develop that gentle nurturing for yourself?
it was hard work and lots of therapy, right? It's like, it's interesting when you ask that question, was like, this was one of the gifts of Gestalt therapy, I think, even though I can be quite like, Gestalt therapy is always like, so, I can be very critical of Gestalt therapy, but, this is one of the gifts, I think. yeah, that I really value and appreciate what Gestalt taught me about gentleness, because sometimes it can be really tough and hard. Like, it feels almost like,
Mm.
but there's also this gentleness.
And I'm also curious, we often talk about Gestalt therapy, but there are Gestalt therapists. And sometimes I wonder, is it the Gestalt therapy that is teaching us, or is it the therapists who are doing it? And I'm wondering, how do you distinguish between that? And maybe one of the questions we ask is, who are the people who impacted you? And somehow I feel it's a right time to bring it in.
So, yes, right. So I had very varied experiences of Gestalt therapy, and but there were these moments of, yeah, gentleness, not always necessarily in therapy, but also in therapy. But yeah, like I have fond memories of some gentleness in groups
Mm.
and some gentleness in one-to-one therapy, but they are very rare because often it's also, some form of like struggle, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Mm. And I'm wondering, what has held you in that struggle?
Madness, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
And just like determination to, I guess, start it differently. I have to now go through the thing, and it took me, I think particularly when you're in training, it's so hard. Like I felt like I didn't have a choice apart from like just being there and staying with it. And it was just after training when I realized, hey, I can also, with growing awareness and learning about my process, that I started learning, hey, I can decide this is too much, or for me, and then do what I need to do. I don't have to stay in groups all the time.
Mm.
I have a choice here if it's too much.
Mm. What helped you to allow yourself that choice? It's very interesting. As I was coming to this interview, I listened to one video about the archetype of the victim, and how it is the work. It is a life work um to understand that we have agency. Um, and so I'm wondering, what's your journey in kind of retrieving back your agency?
Yeah, I think the moment where things shifted, where I felt more comfortable, you know, not to stay in situations that I find difficult or unbearable or, overwhelming. Um, I think that moment started to shift the moment I figured out I'm autistic.
Mm.
That was last year in May. That was my formal diagnosis. But learning about that I might be autistic started like maybe 2-3 years ago.
Mm.
And up to that point, I think what was really, really difficult is I knew something's not quite right, but I didn't know what.
Mm. And I'm wondering wondering the experience of not quite right. What was the information that was coming to you that something is not quite right, and how do you see that now as you have this information?
So I think the key learning for me was that, I have sensory neurological differences, right?
Mm-hmm.
And which makes it sometimes hard to stay in groups. But I always thought I have to overcome these difficulties. That it's somehow, nothing, that it's somehow changeable, right? And I think this is the distinction between some aspects are neurological and some aspects are, maybe trauma related or whatever you want to call it, and that's possible to heal in some way, maybe in groups or something. But I think for me there was this big aha moment, like, oh, I understand now why it's sometimes really hard in groups. Because the sensory input is overwhelming. And what I can do is, like, reduce the sensory input to recover.
And there's something interesting, as I was just writing my essay on diagnosis. And so if you don't mind me asking questions. What I'm curious about is how much having the diagnosis has given you the permission to take care of yourself better. And I'm always almost puzzled. Why is it so difficult to do that before? Why is it just not okay to approach someone without saying, I'm autistic and I need to move away because this is overwhelming for me? Why can't it be just, this is overwhelming for me and I need to move away? And why do we need to find out what is the problem with me? I don't know if my question makes sense.
Yeah, it makes total sense. The diagnosis was for me, not for anybody else. To give myself permission to understand this is not something I can fix. Right? This is sometimes the problem, right? So there are pros and cons with diagnosis, right? And I think I have a hypothesis, I'm not sure, like, but for autistic people, learning they're autistic is really important, because otherwise they keep getting misdiagnosed with all sorts of stuff, and then keep trying to heal. And there are things that are really not possible to heal. So like, when you think of the paradoxical theory of change in Gestalt, right? It pretty much sums it up, like accepting the things you can't change, right? And then change happens. But how do you know? Because I think that there's something almost like, for me, there was this insight was missing. Because I wasn't taught, like in training, we learned about personality disorders, anxiety, depression, trauma, and all sorts of stuff. But we didn't speak a single time about neurological differences and how they might manifest. So, and then also the other thing, what a diagnosis helps with, a lot of people are not being taken seriously. Right? If I disclose I'm autistic, so what happens? You're not autistic. Right? And I'm not disclosing that to excuse anything, right? It's like, for me, there's like, oh, you don't believe me? That's now your thing, because I know, right? I have like I literally worked through it with a specialist, and that diagnosis was confirmed by a psychiatrist, right? So there's like evidence from my mom who has filled in some information about my sensory difficulties from childhood, right? And collecting that data is sometimes really important because a part of me feels gaslit by the medical system. Oh no, it's not that. We don't need diagnoses. Right? It's really not about the diagnoses. It's about knowing who I am, right? And that's been so influenced by other people's opinion.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, it was partially part of my essay, and I guess I'm really curious, what was the shift for you as you finally have had a name for what you have been experiencing all the time?
It was a massive shift. It really gave me permission to not expose myself to more trauma. And yeah,
sorry.
Because I think when you're like autistic, or your wiring is different, right? Whatever. It also involves people with ADHD or dyslexia, dyspraxia, like any type of like neurological difference, right? So what happens over time, and it's not clear or not really identified, there's like trauma of a trauma of a trauma of a trauma of a trauma, and I think for me that was like the first time it's like, I know what it is now. It's not in the inside. I've done 10 years therapy on the inside, right? Still there's something that's not explained. And then shifting, hey, this is some work that needs to be done in the outside by accommodations, by noticing when there is time to pause and, withdraw from sensory overload.
And I'm wondering, what was the process of getting there, and what helped you to notice it for the first time, or to at least suspect, or was it you or someone you worked with who has, and obviously you can stop me, this is just really coming from my curiosity.
The reason why I'm sharing this information is because
so one second, you paused for a second, so maybe the reason you are sharing this information, so if you can start.
Yeah, the reason why I'm sharing this openly is I didn't know anybody like me throughout training, where I knew, okay, this person is autistic, right? Because if I knew that, then I would probably understand. So the way I got aware of that was when I was really unwell. I moved to Spain in 2020 during the pandemic, and it was like, I couldn't communicate in the language, so, and there was some difficulties with how I experienced being a foreigner, an immigrant again, right? But there were some difficulties with that, and that really brought up quite some difficulties. And then a friend, a colleague was like, hey, have you ever looked into ADHD? And I was like, no, I could like, no, I'm not ADHD, because, for me, ADHD had like a very specific pattern. And, but eventually, the more I looked into it, oh, I think I have ADHD, and had my diagnosis first in it. you know, and started medicating the symptoms of ADHD, which helped a lot. But then I was like, hang on a minute, this is not all. There's more. And the more happened, particularly when I started, like, you know, so I was diagnosed by the TikTok algorithm. And this is like beyond comprehension, I think. So that because the way TikTok works, you look at content, and when you engage with the content, you get more of the content. So I started getting all this first ADHD content, but then eventually autistic content. I started engaging more and more and more and more. It's like I could see myself in the people. So, and then going through, you know, because then I still thought like, this is an algorithm. You can't really trust that thing, you know, that doesn't make any sense. Then I went through the motions of a formal diagnosis, you know, with going through this, you know, information gathering. And the outcome was positive. My ex-partner at the time, the first time I said, like, I think I might be autistic, he was like, yeah, you're autistic, 100%. And because of the sensory stuff, right? My ex-partner had to deal with all this smell issues, food issues, like, you know, taste, texture, and yeah, the difficulties, like, you know, he was really affected by that. So he was the first one, like, you know, saying like, yeah, I think that's pretty accurate. But you know, this kind of disclosure of information, what it usually does is some form of like, it's a fashion, is an excuse for being a dick, right? Or it's that and that. But I think a lot of people don't understand the history of that it was studied by white boys originally, a small data set. So there's been now more research. Here some more you know, how it presents in minorities and females and so it's different. And you know, if you're never exposed, like, you know, it's hard to tell.
And
So
I find it also interesting the fact that it is really true that it's not covered in many of our trainings. And I'm curious, how does that then prepare us to even see it in our practice? And what's your experience with that? And do you feel like you would want to influence change in that regard?
yeah, I think it would have really helped, I think, in training to understand more, because I think at the moment how it is, the, you know, how we like conceptualize autism is very specific. And you know, it's called a spectrum because it's like, you know, it can be really, really, really tough. And it's very upsetting for a parent who has like a severely, you know, disabled child to see me speak about autism, or see young people on TikTok, you know, create videos about autism. It can be really upsetting for them. But you know, these videos help me to understand who I am. And that's like difficult. You know, there's like a lot of frustration, complex dynamics going on even within the autistic community. And I'm, you know, like, I'm still feeling like so early in my own journey figuring out who I am, that I never really, you know, really got in contact with anybody, you know, and saw that, like, you know, like there's like, I think there are a lot of people who are autistic in the Gestalt community because it attracts certain type of humans.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also this real, no, I don't need to know any, you know, like there's this rejection of diagnosis because of the pathology and all of that, right? And so, yeah, it's like a real complicated thing, particularly for Gestalt, whereas, yeah, it's sometimes for, like, for me, it was very helpful. And there are autistic people who absolutely think it's like ridiculous to have a diagnosis, right? Because there's also the movement around self-diagnosis. You know, if somebody decides to identify as autistic, you know, it can be really hard for them to hear being dismissed because, like, they don't meet any form of, like, expectation by society. Like, you know, it's like a external thing usually.
I guess that's what the difficulty we always encounter with diagnosis, because people would self-diagnose, and yet there are some, let's say, tested ways of being able to actually diagnose. And so it's always, as you say, it's a very difficult journey. And I guess that's where we are as therapists, where we are actually exploring what does that mean to you, and how and why it is so important. Yeah. There's something very interesting as I ask my questions, and I'm curious whether it's how they land, but there is a kind of smile that is almost like I can't decipher it. And I'm curious, how is that impacting you?
I noticed myself being curious about your essay and what your thought on that is, you know, from your perspective.
Well, I think honestly I felt very frustrated writing it, because 2,000 words doesn't give it justice. Also, I felt very frustrated because I have never been exposed to it's difficult to say, but people with really difficulties that are really impairing their day-to-day functioning. And so I feel it's unfair from me to write about diagnosis without actually ever visiting a mental health hospital. And it feels like I'm basically having an opinion without data. So I think that is one place where I really feel not invited yet, in this place and time of my training, to talk about that. On the other hand, as I am working with clients and have read many things and am trained as a scientist, I do think that there are such things as stable patterns, and they are important in a pragmatic way to guide the journey. And as you mentioned, I feel I have heard in many places that how helpful it can be for people to know, to have a name for what's happening to them. And again, there is a part of me that can be frustrated with the part which you just described of self-diagnosing, and me having to say, I'm not sure if this is how I can name what's happening to you. So I think what I was left with is the complexity of that question. I don't necessarily have a judgment. I personally believe that everything has a value, and a limitation of its usage, including diagnosis. And I really liked what was the most impactful as I was writing it. I think I read this one paper on cultivated uncertainty. And I think that was really the most impactful of how does one cultivate uncertainty, and where do you start to be certain? And maybe that's a question back to you. How did you cultivate that not knowing, and when did you become certain, and what has then that given you?
I think for me, the moment because there's always this internal process, right? So, oh no, this is just an excuse for something, right? And I think the moment where it really dawned on me, but still like not believing, was when I talked to my mom about it. And I, went through the questionnaire with her, like, together, and because she speaks Turkish, right? So the assessment was in English. So I, had to kind of like work with her to get the information. And the moment she started explaining to me like some of the sensory issues, like from childhood, like how I would like couldn't cope with like having sand in my shoes and losing it. Like I was like, oh, okay. And like, and lots of these little details. And still I was like, oh, it's probably like, because the thing is, there's always this like this bias, I think, like for me, like, oh, it's actually not an explanation. So, but then actually having an explanation and somebody who like collated all that data, like, and here's the data, right? So it's like, and I guess the uncertainty is just not great for someone who's autistic. It's like totally dysregulating, and then saying the person, just sit with it. It's easy,
And that is really what I had in mind to ask you, but now it's a really good time. Is where do you think that some of the tools that Gestalt is using can actually then be counterproductive for a person who has autism, and what do you think would need to be adjusted in the way we work as Gestalt therapists with people who have autism?
Yeah. So so one thing that my mind blocked a little bit, and this is not like, I really want to say that it's okay to call it autistic, right? Identity first is like, at least, there are some people who might not, but it's like okay to say autistic person, identity first language. And because the reason why I wanted to bring it up is because I think it's an identity that eventually start to adopt, right? And what I think is missing right now is awareness. Because because there's a lot, it's not like a linear process, like, you're just a little bit autistic or you're very autistic, right? It's more like, different spikes, like sometimes it's sensory issues, sometimes it's social engagement that can be overwhelming, sometimes it's how you communicate, like, there's a lot more to it than just, but there was no teaching about it, right? Because we have very specific, like, these are the pathologies we're not working with, right? And they are usually like utterly disabling. And don't get me wrong, the the experiences I have been disabling, severely disabling.
Yes.
It just, nobody saw it,
Got it.
right? Because there's a thing called masking, so
Mm.
hiding the traits. And so and when you were taught as a kid, like, fit in, pretend you're like a good child, right? And then you kind of like learn
Yeah.
throughout your life to hide your
Pain.
symptoms.
Yeah.
And there's this constant drive for wanting to be normal, or like wanting to belong, but actually never belonging anywhere, like it's almost like everything
Mm.
a little bit alien. And these are the things that nobody tells you. It's very, and don't get me wrong, I know this is meant to be supportive, but normalizing these experiences is very invalidating,
Yes.
right? And pushes you back into some form of closet about, like, trying to find out who you are, really.
Mm. When you say normalizing these experiences, what do you mean normalizing which experiences?
Like, for example, when you say, I feel alien, like nobody understands me.
Mm-hmm.
And then, you go, oh, that's normal. We all have that occasionally, right?
Hmm.
Instead of asking, like, because Gestalt is actually really good to work with, neurodivergent folks. Like,
Mm-hmm.
there's like phenomenology, which is really good for exploring, like, how did you notice that? Like, how long has it been going on? Like, genuine curiosity about it, right? And I don't mean like in a therapeutic context. It can happen in a therapeutic context, but it's getting brushed off, right? But more often, like in day-to-day life, right? When you disclose information that is actually something showing you, hey, there's some difference in here, right? Potentially, if we
Yeah.
explored that, is it where is it originating from? Is it all the time been like that, or is this new? Right? So there's some possibility, and I think the difference between um,
Mm.
autism or neurological differences, it's been there all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. As you just said, actually, that's how I ended my essay, saying that often we can never really know the other, but just giving the hand and reaching out might be enough. And I think you just answered this question really nicely of Gestalt's phenomenology is really the strength of, if you say I feel alien, that's not me to judge whether there has a value. It's about, well, how is it in your experience of alienness?
Yes.
Hmm. I have to say thank you for that reminder. It's always there, but I guess it's yeah, sometimes it,
Yeah.
the old ways creep in.
No, absolutely. And some of the things I understand now more. When I was in training, one of the critiques were like, I'm very much fixed on something, like fixed gestalt of, like, what's going on for the client, yada yada yada. Like, so that was really like hard for me, hard work to. And now it makes so much more sense with the lens of like, oh, that's a version of monotropism, like, being like so focused on one
Mm.
thing, and like struggling with being like fluid in, like, or being creatively indifferent, right?
Mhm.
So it was really, really tough work, like, to go to or get to a place of being more indifferent, right?
Mhm.
But that was like my biggest thing throughout training, to learn, not to be so focused, right? So particularly with clients, because that can be
Mm.
really tough. And
Mm.
but yeah, but and that, at the same time, this can be really helpful when you are working with an autistic client,
Mm.
right? Because there's a theory called the double empathy problem, right? So
Okay, I don't know it, so you can say.
I'm just like sharing all the stuff that I've
Yes.
been accumulating over the last year. So the double empathy problem explains that it's really hard for people with different neurotypes to experience empathy for each other, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is how the idea came into practice that someone who's autistic can't feel empathy, right? Like this is basically when neurotypicals look at autistic individuals, they see no empathy or capacity to be in another person's shoes. But it only applies for neurotypical perspectives, right? Or holistic perspectives, to be more specific.
Mm-hmm.
And empathy manifests within, autistic person to autistic person differently than neurotypical person to autistic person, or vice versa, or any other combination.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the theories that was developed by autistic people and researchers.
Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering how has this then journey shaped you as a therapist?
So most of my clients I work with are neurodivergent
Mm-hmm.
because it's really hard to experience that gap.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm. Yeah. And then I wonder if we go a little bit um along the lines of gender, and you mentioned that autism is expressed differently in different genders. How does that uh, identity, gender identity, also formed you and influenced you? And how does that then kind of communicate with this completely new and other identity?
so my sources are right. So there's some academic sources,
Yeah.
but a vast majority of my sources comes from TikTok.
Yeah.
And there was one person which I thought was so amazing how they described what was going on for them. So gender, I find that really confusing.
Mm-hmm.
And the main reason for that is when I feel inside, I get in touch with my soul. I
Mm-hmm.
don't feel gender. I feel light. I feel non-duality. I feel humanness. I don't know how to describe it, but it feels nice. So then, like, as soon as I go into the world out there, I've been experienced as a man.
Mm-hmm.
And in certain spaces, that might come as a threat, right? And but then also it's also dangerous for me, like when I'm in spaces for men, right? So it's really complicated. So for me, this person who described what's happening is that was so eye-opening. And how they described it, what did they say? They said, like, they differentiated between body gender dysphoria, like being experienced in the body, and then social gender dysphoria.
Mm.
And that was so brilliant. That was like explain, like, I don't have body dysphoria, right? So I'm comfortable in my male body, but I have
Mm.
social gender dysphoria because I'm not welcome in either spaces. Like it feels really alien. The places I feel comfortable and safe are queer gender, like where gender is a little bit more understood as a social
Yeah.
construct rather than like these other spaces I feel safe, right?
Mm.
But exclusive male or exclusive female, or it's sometimes really hard. And
Mm.
now there's an understanding from me, like, that's like social, like that's how I experience, and that made sense to me.
Mm. Mm. And I'm curious about what is it that makes the queer spaces safe for you, and what are the conversations that are still not held publicly that are in those spaces that help you?
The way of communication, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So there might be text-based communication. There
Mm-hmm.
might be video calls for training instead of, face to face.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that is, I think, some of the key aspects that support me, right? So the way of how I engage is not defined by how Gestalt therapy is supposed to be. Like, for example, it needs to be face to face, and you need to be with the person. Don't get me wrong, it's like really beautiful, to work face to face with clients.
Mm-hmm. I mean,
But
that's interesting because I experienced that problem, and it's totally unrelated to gender for me. I mean, for me, that I guess that's part of the world is changing, and some people are adapting faster than others. But to me, I experience similar problems. In the sense that I also sometimes I often prefer to have the fluidity of choosing or not choosing to be in a space with someone or in a training, and and that idea that there is something better or worse than another thing is also very well, I would say frustrating for me, because I think different spaces are offering different opportunities. So I'm curious, what made you kind of connect this to queer spaces, and why do you think that's gendered in that sense?
I guess the main reason is because the first time I had like a really positive, like neurodivergent friendly training experiences when I started training with KICS, the Contemporary Institute for Clinical Sexology. So that is super, neurodivergent and queer friendly. So it was the first time I just felt like, I can go, like, participate. I didn't feel like the odd one out, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I think that's the thing. I feel often like the weird one, but no one
Mm-hmm.
realizes it because I'm like masking, like,
Mm-hmm.
really. And being in that space where it was okay to be, different. And, where there was the training like online, rather, like, and thanks to a lot of is thanks to, like, not thanks to COVID was horrible, right?
Mm-hmm.
But COVID made such a huge shift for people like me
Yes, I can relate to that.
who just find it overwhelming, to be in a space with people together. Like,
Mm. Mm. Yeah, no, I can relate to that. As in, as someone who I feel has quite a sensitive nervous system, um, I do need space with myself in a place where it does not have a lot of sensory input, so that I can process all that information and then come back and be present. And and although I understand, I mean, I guess the difficulty is we cannot get idiosyncratic and to adjust ourselves to everyone. That's why we have the term normal. But but I do experience sometimes difficulty with um not feeling normal. and feeling like this is not for me. Seems to be for, I don't know, 70% of the population, but I don't belong in that 70%. On one aspect or another, it doesn't have to be. So I think, yeah, COVID opened up for me exactly that. Now the ability to be part of so many different groups and trainings and find things that work for me in ways that work for me, so I can relate to that in some way. Yeah. And then one of the questions which we ask, and I guess this is another, we're somewhat related to what we were just discussing, is the question of power and privilege. And I wonder how it can, you might completely not connect it to what we just talked about, but I feel like it's really highly connected to it. So I'm wondering.
Yeah, I think I'm very aware of my privilege, coming across as a white man, right? Like, without knowing I'm Middle Eastern, without knowing Muslim heritage, without knowing I'm autistic, without knowing I'm queer. And that is, I think, what made it so hard to, figuring out who I am, because of all the intersectional layers of oppression that weren't really like overt, like, so, but, there's like constant marginalization when I was living in Germany, and one way or another. And I think now I can appreciate my privilege, you know. But it felt for the most of my life that I wasn't.
And I'm also I'm curious about authenticity, because I guess what I'm hearing is that finally, and correct me if I'm wrong, finally you feel like you're in space where you can authentically express yourself. Is that somewhat true? And
Yeah, so you see, this is always like a difficult one, because in some spaces, it's always like it's like a constant, never-ending story of coming out, right? It's like just a never-ending story of like, and in some spaces it's like not necessary, right?
Yeah, because I'm imagining, because you're not even asked about this.
Yeah.
You're seen just as a human, and you're asked about those qualities.
See, yeah, this is a tricky one, because if you are in a space where everybody is cisgender, heterosexual, neurotypical,
Yeah.
right? So it's really hard in that it's almost like you need to come out with, what are your pronouns, right? And this can be so overwhelming sometimes, because there might be days I like they them pronouns. There might be days where I'm like he him, and some friends with consent are allowed to call me she, right? And this doesn't make any sense to somebody who's not autistic or divergent. Like, like it's like, what? Why are you doing this? Because my internal is not like everybody's else, internal.
Yeah, I mean, again, I find it very interesting, but I have never had those struggles, because for me she seems to be quite constant. But I still find it very puzzling why it is so difficult. If you would now tell me, I really want you to call me she, why would it be such a struggle for me to do that? That's something that I still don't understand. The problem we're making, where I don't feel it is actually a problem to just shift. Well, I mean, I write they them for in my pragmatic tracker for my clients just because I want to conceal their identity. So it's actually really easy. So that's where I really find it so puzzling that, I mean, I understand your struggles and yet I don't, but not because of you, but just because of why what is this? It seems that this is touching something deeper than I just changed my language. And I guess that's where the resistance comes. And as you said this, I just felt like a wave of sadness that it's like that, and I know it is.
Yeah, I think it has become a real political thing, particularly on the back of trans community at the moment. And it's just really sad to see, like, all the rhetoric and the it's difficult. But then, at the same time, it's like a way of exercising power, I suppose, with, like the divide and conquer, divide and conquer. So this is how, look at those over there, they are the bad guys. So,
yeah.
And, the thing is, it's really hard to feel compassion for the other if they are like literally telling you doesn't matter what you think or what you experience, it's like,
yeah
so it's tricky one, and that's why my colleagues Vikram and John, we wrote this book on gender, sex, and relationship diversity, and we had like I think quite a lot of people contribute to chapters. It was just insane how many people in the Gestalt community actually wanted to talk about this, and beyond the Gestalt community, help depathologizing some of the concepts that may not be appropriate anymore. So that was the reason why I agreed to this interview, to advertise for the book. But I'm really shit at, excuse my friend, English, but I'm not good at advertising, so it's like oh,
you've just done it.
like
yeah
but
yeah, I'm very curious and I can't wait for it to come out. When is it coming out, actually?
So it's coming out in March. Yeah, like I think end of March or so, like it will be available. So it's been really, I can't tell you how much that project was a work of the souls, I think. Because it can be quite isolating when you like in your own little bubble.
And now there is an opportunity for many people to hear your voices. Yeah. And I'm curious now. I think we kind of covered a lot of the questions, but what is it that attracted you to therapy and Gestalt, actually?
I think it was a bad idea. Just one of those random bad ideas that I have, like writing a book, or co-authoring and co-writing a book, right? So it's not just me. This was like a team effort of lots of different people who put their hearts and souls into that. But it was one of those moments where I was like lost and trying to find out, who am I and what is my purpose here, in life.
And what were you before being a Gestalt therapist, or what was it that was your identity, or however you want to put it?
Yeah, so I worked in in software development, and then software design, and then software IT design stuff, then user experience. And at the moment I'm doing two jobs. I'm working as a researcher as well, for mainly around software usage and studying people and stuff. But and as a therapist, but I'm more and more drawn into research. I feel like that's something that really interests me and excites me. But yeah, it was a fish restaurant where I was with my partner in Spain, and I was sitting, like there, and we left, and I was like, what could I do in Spain that is not an office job? It's like, maybe counseling or therapy. There are lots of Germans and English speaking expats, immigrants, okay, expats. Not me to offend anyone, sorry. So and I was like, about counseling or something like that. And so and then in my research, I ended up at the Gestalt Center, where I did a year of like a certificate, and I loved it. And then I went to Metanoia, studied for the master. Then I went to Spain, lived there 2 years, and came back. So.
And what was this? I mean, that's one question I didn't ask, but you mentioned your immigrant history, and what do you think? Because on one hand, I felt there is the neurodivergence and being different in that way, but then on the other hand, is bringing so many different cultures with you, which by default makes you different from the majority of the people living in the country you are in at that moment. So how has that shaped you, and also maybe added to or taken away from the feeling of alienation?
Yeah, I think that was always the explanation for my sense of alienation, right? That it was because I was foreign in Germany. I was Muslim background. And I think the moment where I had a little bit of a pause from that was when I moved to the UK. That was like so healing for me to, suddenly be a foreigner, but like that being accurate, because in Germany, I was always like foreigner, even though I spoke German, I'm still foreigner some way, and sometimes not really explicit, right? But there's always a sense like I'm a foreigner here, so I have to behave. I have to work harder. I have to, be in a certain way to be accepted. And weirdly, when I got to the UK, that was like, suddenly it was like, oh, where are you from? I was like, Germany. And they're like, oh, you're German. It's like, yeah, but my family is Turkish. Oh, you're Turkish. It's like, yes, I'm both somehow. But, in Germany, it's like you're one or the other. Or in Turkey, you're one of the, it's very complicated. But then Brexit happened, and that was like so painful. And, I think then I realized, it's not just the immigrant identity of being, from another country, but there's more to it than just. But yeah, I think the accuracy felt nice in the UK, that really helped to heal quite a lot and do things that I wasn't, meant to do in Germany, particularly education, like a therapist, becoming a therapist. Here I can work in the NHS if I wanted to, like technically I could apply and, it's like UKCP registration, you're welcome to work in the NHS where they hire a Gestalt therapist, right? In Germany, it's like they have this different systems in some way. And, Gestalt is still considered pseudoscience in Germany and in Spain. In Spain, even worse, they've been accused of cult-like tactics from psychological bodies, and then there's a lot of.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. And then the Spanish Association sued them, and like I think if I understood it correctly, or Facebook translated it correctly, but yeah, it's shocking to see that, because here in the UK you have an MSc or an MA, you have like academic standard, and then somebody go, you're not scientific enough. I'm like, really?
I must say, as you're talking about this, that is my experience of the UK. I felt I could be all of the identities I was hiding, and suddenly they all have a space to belong. And it's not I still sometimes satisfy that belonging in non-UK spaces, but UK allowed me the fact that that is okay as well. And it is there is something really special also about, I feel, how people are taking care of inclusion, and always think things can be better, but kind of coming from like an ethnically pure country where difference is really frowned upon. Coming here was a really liberation in a way, and just even the messaging in the tube or things like that, it is really healing, I have to say.
Yeah, I think, like in principle, like I know that being autistic often creates this kind of like not belonging or not feeling home like anywhere. But I think the UK, or it's been the closest I can get to a sense of like acceptance, I guess, or feeling welcome enough, like, and I guess the closest I could get to a sense of home.
So what is home like for you?
So I guess the less I try to fit in some box, right, the less I try. I guess it goes back to masking. The less I mask or hide or try to hide, the more I feel home. And I'm alone here in Liverpool. There's my dog, right? So I feel home because I can shape what I need. Like, I feel like I'm in, I have the power. Like, that's where it goes, like the personal power to, to shape my environment, my needs, like how I want to live. So it's been harder in other countries.
And what do you like about Gestalt therapy? What excites you about it?
It's a little bit like the rebel under the therapy modalities, So that excites me, really. It's like the punk kid or something, like the outcast, it's like attracting all these outcasts, and they all don't haven't figured out now, you know, what, like, and it's very, you know, like diverse, I want to say at the same time, but then also sometimes it's hard because, yeah, because there's also yeah, some rigidity sometimes, you know, which I find difficult, like, you know, that you have to see a Gestalt therapist if you're training Gestalt, because other therapy modalities are a little bit more open, that you have to see somebody face to face, right? And it changed luckily with COVID that, you know, you can now balance it, but then, you know, somebody who has a difference or disability and doesn't know that, right? This is the important thing. I didn't know. I didn't know. So I forced myself through that, like, you know, like on the verges of burnout all the time, you know. And, you know, the thing is, when having a special interest, right? And if you're really like, it's great. So Gestalt was for a long time my special interest, right? So, but some of the elements I think could be more open, and that's coming from someone who's like autistic. So, you know, that's something to think about.
Yeah. So yeah, that is actually interesting. So how important is then predictability for you?
Very important. That's why I actually really struggled to do this interview in the first place, right? Because I thought, can I do it in writing, right? That was my, when you asked me, I was like, hey, is it possible? And because that is so liberating, you know, if you can do it in text sometimes, because it gives you time to reflect and think about things, but then also it takes away the, I guess, the spontaneity, right? And I can go into some, like, lots of theoretical stuff, like so easy to, you know, go into concepts and theories, but yeah, I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but
I'm curious what I heard from that it is important for you to stay in contact and not go into the ideas. And I was, what was happening for me as you were saying that how you plowed through and survived, and here you are being a therapist. I'm wondering, what do you feel about when, as you're now speaking about that, what do you feel about actually being able to do that and being now here on the other side?
I might regret it later. Right?
Okay.
But at the same time, you know, it's almost like I've been hiding for so long, you know. If I can't talk about these phenomena, and then we're going to stay where we are, right? So part of me is like, you know, really wanting to help understand. And, you know, this is the thing. How do you do that? It's tricky. So writing books, yes, feels good. Can hide, you know, do it on my own.
So does that mean that what you're left with is anger? Is this partly disappointment? Or
no, I think I'm. So that was part of the trauma processing, post-diagnosis, anger, and, you know, grief and all of that. Like, after the diagnosis. It was like I knew it was like everybody was talking about it in the autistic community. I knew it was like, I was like, really, I'm not sure if I'm going to look back with an autistic lens and then suddenly process all the traumas again. But it did happen. So there's quite a lot of therapeutical processing already of anger, disappointment, and sadness, and all of that. So actually, it's more like, what can I do
now
to help, right? And that looks like so scary. Like if I even talk about it, because we are at the age of artificial intelligence. I was helped by an artificial intelligence, an algorithm, far more than everybody else could cut through, like help me cut through the noise. So this is where my mind is like, my special interest is going now, is that like, how can I help the community? Like those who feel lost and like don't understand something's not adding up here. How can I help? And sometimes it's about removing bias, including my bias. I know I'm biased now, right? I have these, like, I know it now, but how can I help with all this stuff? And the way traditional forms are really hard for me, right? So traditional forms of going into education, training, yada, 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 is really, really tough because I find groups just overwhelming, and I don't want to learn to be good in group process. It's like something I've been trying for 5 years, and so what can you do?
That's my question. What do you think one can do to mediate change and bring awareness, and what can be done differently then?
So my hope is by being open and sharing some lived experience, right? That there's some genuine curiosity rather than it's a fashion, right? It's very harmful to say that for people because it's an opinion, it's a bias, right? So based on the person's lived experience, but this might be different for people who are on the margins, been pathologized with personality disorder, with bipolar disorder, but actually they are autistic. And what happens is, because of their trying all the things and it not working, still, like, there's been a study from the Cambridge Research Center that a lot of successful suicides were likely to be committed by autistic individuals. And that makes so much sense to me, because you're trying to fix something that's not fixable, right? And learning that is only possible through clinicians becoming more aware of it, like, therapists becoming more aware of it, and not brush it off like it's a fashion.
And what I'm hearing is that you had therapists brushing it over as a fashion?
No, but also none of them knew, or maybe they knew it, they never disclosed it or shared that. Like, also, there's this thing of therapists not diagnosing. So I think, I'm not sure if that's like, there are some ethical dilemmas sometimes, particularly if somebody is autistic or neurodivergent. At least there's some, it's really hard to disclose information to clients, but sometimes it's so important to do it. It can be life altering, right? If somebody told me before, in training or in therapy or anywhere else, have you ever thought, do you know about autism? There were moments where, like, like some subtle hints by people who were like, but because it's like, yeah,
Yeah.
it's never been like, never went in, like,
Yeah. And I'm curious, that's one of the questions, but I think this might have answered it. Like, what have been your biggest challenges when it comes to Gestalt? And is this the only one, or is there things that you want to add?
See, a part of me thinks like, if I knew I was autistic, my training experience would have been so much more different, because I know the people who train, they are deeply caring, they really care for your well-being, but I didn't know. So, and nobody else knew, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And what are your fondest memories that are connected to the Gestalt?
I think when I was 2 years in Spain, and just like in this trauma after trauma after trauma after trauma, like, feeling like I'm driving on the wrong side of the street, like, and I came back to the UK, to the UK AGP conference. I just felt like, oh my God, I'm coming home. It was like seeing all these beautiful souls in one place, and just felt like so nourishing. I felt so deprived when I got to the UK of any form of like support or care, and because I knew I was autistic, I just didn't expose myself to all the things that,
Yeah.
and again, it goes back to, because it was for me to know I don't have to do it, not for everybody else, because it really helps to be able to say, I can't do this, not because I don't want to, but simply because there is a reason, right? There's a reason, there's some difference. And because usually there's always, the care that is there, right? It's also, hey, come on, you can do this, right? It's like almost like from a place of love and care, right?
Yeah.
But it's finding that balance, and if there's something that has nothing to do, like, there's sensory overwhelm, and that's why I can't go into this group right now.
And
It's
completely personal, and
but yeah, it's really hard to know that and communicate that. Again, this is like a social communicational difficulty, right? That manifests in ways that are not 100% like, obvious.
Yeah. 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 And I think this answered my next question, but do you feel like you're part of a Gestalt community?
Very much in the UK AGP.
And where do you see Gestalt going forward? And what do you think is next for you and next for Gestalt?
So I think Gestalt has a very particular role it can play, because it's a bit like really creative, and it can really help people who are neurodivergent. There's a lot of good things in there. The challenges with some of the elements might sometimes be a bit, too much and too confrontational or too intense, and like finding that balance between the good things. And, like from my point of view, because I am neurodivergent, I work with neurodivergent folks, and that is what I'm trying to bring and work on, like, the gentleness and the softness. But then also there will be times where what I say might be really tough, right? Because being Gestalt and autistic, right? So there might be some mishaps, which is really hard for neurotypicals sometimes to experience, right? So this is, again, goes back to the double empathy problem, where there's sometimes, so I'm trying to work with mostly neurodivergent clients because it's, it's easier for them, it's easier for me. But I don't know, like where Gestalt goes is, I think, hopefully more acceptance in society that, therapy, like that it is scientific, because that is just still like such a funny gatekeeping thing. Like I think, yeah, where Gestalt can help is, I think, with gatekeeping, because it's been like, told it's not good enough or whatever. And there's a lot of, I think, particularly when you go abroad, you can notice that there's gatekeeping around how it's treated, and only psychodynamic and CBT approaches, which can be really damaging for someone who's autistic. So yeah, there's a lot where it can help, and I see a lot of autistic, professionals talking about phenomenology and how it, really makes sense to someone who's autistic.
I think we have gone through all the questions, but I'm wondering if there is any question you would like to ask yourself, which I haven't, or ask me, which you haven't.
I'm very curious how your experiences of training.
I do experience quite a lot of frustration with with the rigidity of it. I mean, coming from a very corporate environment where I work, I understand it, and I don't, because on one hand, there is this idea of meeting the client where they are and trying to understand how we can meet them there, and yet we somehow, I don't feel there is a place to explore our own where we are and our own intuitive knowing. And saying that, I feel like I had that as well. So I think there is obviously that challenge. If we want Gestalt to be recognized as academic, we need to fit a certain form, and then how much is that form then compatible with really learning and teaching people to trust their gut, because having an external structure often is an impediment to really getting in touch with where is my intuition taking me now. So I guess I'm always holding that polarity, and basically navigating how can I be present in both. But I do feel like it is quite challenging, and this, I experienced a lot of my group as well, including me being quite stressed around some of the demands And I think that obviously would impact how we work with clients and how we make decisions. And do we work with clients for the hours, or do we take on a client which we really know we can work with? And I guess those are all the questions that come into play. But in a way, I also feel like that is a preparation for real life anyways, because there won't be always a time that we will not have another external demand which will influence the choice we make. So I think this, to me, the way I'm experiencing it is lifelike. Although sometimes it's frustrating, but I guess life in its nature is frustrating.
Yeah, and I think after the training, I realized all this difficulties you experienced in group process, and like basically group process makes you the therapist you are in some way.
Yeah.
And it's really, really hard. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I also think that the expectation of it not being hard is probably, yeah, it's probably then one would not go into the depth. And I don't necessarily think that I don't necessarily think you should be traumatized by it. So that's where I really want to make a distinction.
Yes.
And I think that's always the place where one needs to balance. And what I learned, and I'm learning still, is allowing oneself to say, well, I've done 2 years, I can defer one if I need to take a break. And that is the choicefulness we have, which I feel like it's from the wider field of having to do things in a certain deadline, on a certain speed. I think if there we kind of allow ourselves choicefulness, the experience will be better, because it doesn't have to be 5 years, it can be 7 or 8 if necessary, or but I think it's coming from just this wider field of how fast tracked you need to be in something. So I think I've slowly started to realize that there is space for choicefulness. It's just that one also needs to allow, I think the most difficult thing for me is to acknowledge and recognize my own limitations.
Yes, right. This is so hard. And that was the thing that I really couldn't gauge when I was in training. It's like took me so much after training, and I started like, hey, slow down, relax.
Yes. Yeah. That, and I think that that's where I started to realize, when I allowed myself these things, then I realized, well, then no one is really pressuring me if I have that choice. But it's a journey. It's really a huge journey to get there, and that journey is difficult. Yeah.
And I think that's fair enough. It's like sometimes it's like it's knowing, I guess, and knowing there are possibilities of taking, like, because for me I was just like, nope, once I'm on the track, I'm like,
Yeah.
right. And there are a lot of fun memories, like some of the some beautiful souls that I met in training who've been like friends, and like lifetime friends, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, I guess so much is shared and experienced together, and it's difficult to not get a sort of an intimacy and stay at that collegial level. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you too.